Olá, boa tarde a todos e todas que nos acompanham aqui hoje.
Olá, boa tarde a todos e todas que nos acompanham. Buenas tardes a todos e todas.
Desculpa, eu estou com um problema no áudio aqui. Vamos lá então, de novo, gente, desculpa. Boa tarde a todos e todas que nos acompanham. Nós estamos abrindo agora o último debate do Seminário Internacional de Governança da Internet, abordando um tema extremamente atual, e não à toa, porque a gente pensou e construiu esse ciclo de debates justamente se apoiando nessa linha cronológica, né, com relação tanto aos avanços da internet desde a sua criação, como da sua governança, que consequentemente também foi se transformando, e precisa ser, na verdade, né, para que consiga responder a uma realidade que não é estática. Afinal, as tecnologias digitais que hoje fazem parte da vida em sociedade, elas estão em contínuo processo de inovação, né? Então, a ideia desse seminário, ela estava baseada nisso, em construir uma lógica temporal que resgatasse o início dessa história sobre a governança da internet, como ela foi idealizada, seu processo de institucionalização, os desafios que foram encontrados e ainda hoje se fazem presentes com relação ao funcionamento técnico da infraestrutura, até se chegar a um cenário mais atual de desenvolvimento e uso da tecnologia e que apresenta novos desafios e também mais atuais, né? Foram ao todo 7 encontros, realizados todos online e ao vivo, com especialistas de altíssimo nível nesse campo da governança da internet, de diferentes países e regiões, e que eu acho que vale dizer aqui, nos surpreenderam com as suas respostas super atenciosas, e vindas também com um reconhecimento sobre a importância dessa proposta, que foi colocada, de discutir de forma propositiva a construção e o papel desse regime de governança nos dias atuais, né? Foi um trabalho que levou mais ou menos uns 7 meses de dedicação até sair do papel, e porque ele não termina aqui também. Como mais uma iniciativa da Escola de Governança da Internet, a intenção é que esse seminário ele possa ser o início de um projeto maior, sempre para ampliar e aprofundar o debate sobre a governança da internet como pilares da IGI, no seu compromisso com a capacitação de atores do ecossistema, mas principalmente que esses debates possam vir a contribuir com a construção de novos caminhos, capazes de responder aos tantos desafios que o avanço da internet e as suas aplicações a partir da web nos trazem, e muitos deles já brilhantemente colocados nos debates anteriores desse seminário. Eu acho que nós estamos vivendo uma época que não é fácil, é uma fase de grandes transformações, talvez sentidas num primeiro momento mais a nível social e político, principalmente, e que já vinham impactando a organização da vida em sociedade, mesmo antes da gente enfrentar uma pandemia global, né? É uma fase que também, em função dessas mudanças, vem acompanhada por conflitos, incertezas e, às vezes, até a sensação de um caos social, né? De um modo ou de outro, a internet, como ferramenta cada vez mais central na vida em sociedade, ela está ligada a essas mudanças, quando ela não é o próprio vetor, tanto da mudança como do caos, né? A pandemia, ela veio, eu acho que, de certo modo, acelerando todo esse processo. Primeiro, ela nos tornou mais dependentes da internet, com a necessidade de isolamento e distanciamento social. As nossas atividades diárias e a nossa interação com o outro, elas passaram a ser feitas necessariamente com a mediação de algum tipo de plataforma digital. Depois, eu acho que ela amplia um pouco a noção de uma sociedade interconectada e nos aproxima da ideia de que não somos ilhas isoladas, a gente vive num mundo global, e a gente faz parte de uma natureza, onde cada organismo se conecta de tal forma que a ação de um só já reflete no todo, né? Um evento que começou do outro lado do mundo, está impactando a nossa vida de maneira irreversível, né? E, sem dúvida, a pandemia também aprofundou conflitos, incertezas e o caos, mesmo que em alguns lugares mais que em outros, mas ainda assim afetando toda a natureza humana. Tem um trecho de um poema do John Donne que abre o livro Por Quem os Sinos Dobram, do Hemingway, que, aliás, narra a destruição da condição humana em uma guerra, né? Bem metafórico para os dias de hoje. Enfim, o trecho diz: nenhum homem é uma ilha isolada. Cada homem é parte do continente, parte do todo. Se um torrão é arrastado para o mar, a Europa fica diminuída, como se fosse um promontório, como se fosse a casa do teu amigo ou a tua própria. E fazendo uma analogia com a internet, que também está inserida nessa natureza e também a ela afeta, nesse momento é ainda mais importante a gente voltar as nossas atenções sobre como essa ferramenta tem sido utilizada, os seus efeitos positivos ou danosos sobre a vida em sociedade. Porque diferente de uma pandemia, que apesar de tudo é um evento natural e foge um pouco das nossas capacidades de evitar que esse evento aconteça, a internet é uma criação humana. E por isso a gente tem a capacidade, o dever de acompanhar, de guiar e até de controlar essa criação para que ela possa trazer impactos mais positivos para a vida das pessoas e para a vida em uma sociedade que será cada vez mais interconectada. Então, enfim, acabando aqui a divagação, isso tudo só para dizer que o esforço na concepção desses encontros foi grande e não se encerra com esse debate de hoje. E para agradecer a todas as pessoas que participaram e apoiaram o processo de elaboração dessa iniciativa e a realização desse seminário. No YouTube vocês estão vendo só a cara de algumas pessoas, mas tem agora, por exemplo, pelo menos 10 pessoas numa sala de Zoom que estão possibilitando que isso tudo aconteça. Então, eu agradeço a todas essas pessoas, em nome da equipe da IGI e do professor Glaser, que a partir da sua ativa e dedicada coordenação, acompanha e acredita na importância das iniciativas de disseminação do conhecimento. E para falar sobre o debate de hoje, que vai abordar a forma como novas empresas de tecnologia se apropriam e se organizam em torno da infraestrutura da rede e como isso vem impactando a sociedade, nós recebemos a Selena Nemorim, o Ulisses Merrias e a Fernanda Bruno, que vai moderar essa conversa. Agradecemos imensamente a vocês também por terem aceitado o nosso convite, o desafio de discutir esse tema no âmbito da governança da internet e pela dedicação que tiveram na preparação dessa mesa. E antes de apresentar a Fernanda, eu queria só deixar aqui o final do poema de John Donne, que diz: a morte de qualquer homem me diminui, porque sou parte do gênero humano, e por isso não perguntes por quem os sinos dobram, eles dobram por ti. E um pedido para que fiquem em casa sempre que possível. Tá difícil para todo mundo, mas vai passar, e quanto mais a gente pensar e agir de forma coletiva, empática e responsável, mais rápido vai passar. Então, Fernanda, ela é professora do programa de pós-graduação em Comunicação e Cultura do Instituto de Psicologia da UFRJ. Ela é coordenadora do MediaLab.UFRJ, pesquisadora do CNPq e membro fundadora da Rede Latino-Americana de Estudos em Vigilância, Tecnologia e Sociedade, a LAVITS. Ela foi pesquisadora visitante na Sciences Po, de Paris, e no Departamento de Humanidades Digitais do King's College, em Londres. Atualmente é pesquisadora colaboradora do Surveillance Study Center da Queen's University, em Canadá, e entre os seus livros recentes estão Máquinas de Ver, Modos de Ser, Vigilância, Tecnologia e Subjetividade, da editora Sulina, e Tecnopolíticas da Vigilância, Perspectivas da Margem, da editora Boitempo. Ela é coeditora da revista DR. Fernanda, muito obrigada por estar aqui conosco hoje, e a gente te deseja um ótimo debate.
Obrigada, Luísa, por essa apresentação inspiradora. Eu dou boa tarde a todas e todos que estão nos assistindo. É um prazer enorme estar mediando essa mesa do Seminário Internacional de Governança da Internet. Eu quero agradecer, inicialmente, claro, ao convite, né? Quero agradecer à Escola de Governança da Internet pelo convite, louvar a iniciativa. Tenho acompanhado os debates, as mesas, que têm sido incríveis, parabenizar toda a equipe de organização do evento e agradecer e parabenizar também todo o pessoal aqui que está no apoio para que esse evento aconteça. Eu quero, claro, depois desses agradecimentos iniciais, dizer da minha alegria e da minha honra de estar mediando essa mesa, que conta com pessoas que eu admiro muito, cujo trabalho eu já conheço e já venho acompanhando há algum tempo. Então, quero agradecer a presença da professora Selena Nemorim e do professor Ulisses Merrias. É uma alegria, realmente, uma honra ter essa oportunidade de escutar vocês e de dialogar com vocês. A Selena Nemorim é professora do Departamento de Cultura, Comunicação e Mídia da University College London, já tendo atuado também na London School of Economics e na Monash University, na Austrália. A Selena tem pesquisas interessantíssimas na interseção de temas como educação, tecnologia e equidade, vem trabalhando com questões de gênero, raça e direitos humanos, políticas do afeto na cultura digital e economia política da inteligência artificial. Ela é autora dos livros Biovigilância no Marketing de Novas Mídias, Mundo, Discurso e Representação, publicado em 2018, e autora também de um livro mais recente, de um livro mais antigo, que se chama Escolaridade Cotidiana na Época Digital, na Era Digital. O Ulisses Merrias é professor associado de Estudos de Comunicação e diretor do Instituto para o Engajamento Global da Universidade do Estado de Nova York. É também pesquisador do projeto Observatório de Algoritmos. Seu trabalho de pesquisa tem se voltado para estudos críticos de internet, teoria e ciência de rede, filosofia, sociologia de tecnologia, economia política das mídias digitais. O Ulisses é autor de um livro que eu não vou usar aqui traduzir, vou falar o título em inglês, Of the Network, Disturbing the Digital World, que foi publicado em 2013, e mais recentemente, em coautoria com Nick Cowdery, Ulisses publicou o instigante livro Os Custos da Conexão, como os dados estão colonizando a vida humana e se apropriando dela para o capitalismo. A mesa de hoje, como a Luísa já antecipou, ela é a última mesa de uma série, né, de conversas, de debates, de apresentações que se iniciou em março, e ela integra o terceiro eixo temático do evento, que é um eixo sobre plataforma, poder e vigilância. Né? O tema mais específico da mesa, a Luísa já antecipou, é um tema que se volta para os modelos de negócios da internet, as distopias da inovação. Os palestrantes, né, convidados aqui, eles foram convidados a reagir à questão sobre as plataformas e os seus modelos de negócios, né, tentando pensar um pouco de que maneira a gente pode lidar com o poder dos novos serviços de internet, de modo a evitar monopólios, e qual seria a consequência disso para a governança da internet. Nos vários debates, né, e textos atuais hoje sobre as plataformas digitais, tem sido muito recorrente a imagem ou a metáfora do ecossistema. É uma imagem que eu também utilizo, porque eu acho que ela é oportuna para sinalizar não só a escala do problema, quando a gente está falando de plataformas digitais e quando a gente está falando de toda a cultura digital, na verdade, mas também ela nos ajuda a sinalizar uma necessidade de a gente se reposicionar em termos cognitivos, sensoriais, sociais, práticos, tecnopolíticos, nesse contexto, se a gente quiser construir coletivamente perspectivas e políticas voltadas, seja para o bem comum, seja para uma forma de habitar esse ecossistema que leve em conta a complexidade e a interdependência dos muitos elementos e das muitas camadas que estão em jogo nesse ecossistema digital, né? As mesas que aconteceram antes dessa, ao longo do evento, abordaram diversos aspectos dessas muitas camadas que constituem esse ecossistema, né? Falou-se aqui da camada infraestrutural, falou-se aqui dos protocolos e das suas implicações tecnopolíticas, falou-se aqui de governança, e esse terceiro eixo, ele focaliza mais a questão das plataformas, né, das plataformas propriamente ditas, envolvendo aí, né, navegadores, mídias sociais, motores de busca, serviços de nuvem, serviços de marketing, lojas de aplicativo, etc., todo esse mundo com o qual nós já estamos completamente familiarizados, e, claro, toda a dinâmica de produção e circulação e tratamento de dados e de conteúdos que envolve as pessoas, né, os algoritmos, as interfaces, as aprendizagens de máquina e uma série de outros processos. Nós sabemos também, e isso já foi mencionado algumas vezes aqui em diversos painéis, que embora a gente esteja, sempre que a gente esteja falando de internet, sempre que a gente está falando de plataforma, embora a gente esteja sempre falando de processos globais, esses processos não são homogêneos e nem são uniformes. Eles envolvem assimetrias, desigualdades e diferenças que precisam ser consideradas na nossa reflexão e na nossa ação. No caso das plataformas e dos seus modelos de negócios, que são o tema desse painel, a gente sabe da enorme concentração de poder em um número pequeníssimo de corporações que dominam não apenas os modelos de negócios e os espaços de interação na web, mas interferem expressivamente nas dinâmicas sociais, perceptivas, atencionais, subjetivas, políticas, afetivas e econômicas da web e da vida em geral, uma vez que essas arquiteturas algorítmicas que estão presentes e atuantes nessas plataformas, elas cumprem uma agenda própria e muito restrita de influência de comportamentos, voltada para a produção de engajamento em seus próprios serviços, suas próprias aplicações e seus próprios ambientes, num ciclo que se retroalimenta e que vem empobrecendo dinâmicas mais efetivamente coletivas e voltadas para o comum. Mais uma vez, esse fenômeno que a gente sabe que é global, envolve concentração de poder e envolve impactos locais extremamente assimétricos. Para isso, por isso, na verdade, né, nós que estamos situados em lugares como o Brasil, ou em regiões da América Latina, ou mais amplamente no chamado Sul Global, precisamos urgentemente fortalecer o debate e uma agenda decolonial de reflexões e de ações que possam, inclusive, inspirar modelos de governança. Nós estamos vivendo no Brasil, como a Luísa lembrou, um momento especialmente distópico, não apenas por conta da condução notoriamente desastrosa da pandemia de Covid-19 por parte do governo federal, mas também por conta da postura extremamente colonial com que o governo vem tratando bases de dados importantes e estratégicas em setores como educação, trabalho, meio ambiente, entre outros, fazendo parcerias com empresas como Microsoft, Google, por exemplo, de uma forma extremamente negligente. Para usar aqui um termo que a pesquisadora Beatriz Busanich propôs em relação ao Estado argentino, eu acho que também se aplica ao Brasil. Essas parcerias, né, feitas de forma muito negligente, para dar um exemplo a vocês, um exemplo que eu venho acompanhando mais de perto no âmbito do MediaLab.UFRJ e da rede Lavitz, o governo federal anunciou em outubro do ano passado uma parceria com a Microsoft que se chama Mais Brasil. Né? Essa parceria ela envolve o uso de ferramentas de inteligência artificial fornecidas pela Microsoft para os setores de emprego e de sustentabilidade. Para o setor de emprego, que foi o que eu acompanhei e estou acompanhando, essa parceria envolve a implementação de inteligência artificial para intermediação de mão de obra num portal, que é um portal de vagas de pessoas que estão procurando emprego, e que se chama o Sistema Nacional de Emprego. Né? E, além disso, a Microsoft está oferecendo qualificação de trabalhadores através de uma escola do trabalhador numa plataforma de ensino remoto, utilizando ferramentas, obviamente, da própria Microsoft. Esse conjunto de dados que hoje constitui, por exemplo, o Sistema Nacional de Emprego, que é um dos maiores sistemas de intermediação de mão de obra do mundo, é uma fonte claramente privilegiada de informação sobre um mercado de trabalho gigantesco, como é o do Brasil, e permite não só um diagnóstico sobre o mercado de trabalho formal, né, um diagnóstico conjuntural, atual, né, como permite também análises de mais longo prazo, projetando tendências sobre as transformações estruturais no setor ocupacional no Brasil, e também permitindo, claro, a influência de políticas públicas, o desenho de oportunidades futuras de negócios em várias frentes. Então, isso é um exemplo para vocês terem a dimensão desse tipo de parceria extremamente marcada, né, por uma postura colonial. E esse projeto, ele envolve também, né, o uso de inteligência artificial para a prevenção de queimadas e desmatamento na floresta amazônica, assim como envolve a expansão da infraestrutura de nuvem da Microsoft no Brasil e construção de uma nova região de data center no Rio de Janeiro. Então, esse é um entre inúmeros exemplos de transferência de dados estratégicos do setor público para empresas de hospedagem e processamento de dados de grandes plataformas. Ao mesmo tempo, né, que a gente tem esse cenário bastante preocupante, a gente tem no Brasil, e isso se estende também a outras regiões do chamado Sul Global, uma história fortíssima de movimentos de autonomia tecnológica envolvendo a sociedade civil e, em alguns momentos da nossa história, também o Estado, né, como o movimento de software livre, movimento por espectro livre, de construção de redes comunitárias, e uma história de pioneirismo e inovação na construção de modelos multissetoriais de governança da internet, do qual o CGI, né, o Comitê Gestor da Internet do Brasil, e o processo também de construção do Marco Civil da Internet são referências, né, excelentes. Então, esse painel, ele visa, né, contribuir para a continuidade e renovação dessa história, né, dessa história de conquista, de autonomia tecnológica, de conquista, de espaços coletivos, né, de construção de infraestruturas sociotécnicas e tecnopolíticas, somando, né, a essa história perspectivas interseccionais e decoloniais, convidando a Celina Nimmerman, que tem um trabalho incrível sobre inteligência artificial, tecnologias digitais, equidade de gênero, raça e educação, e o Ulisses Mejias, que também tem uma reflexão e uma atuação extremamente inspiradora no campo do que ele propõe chamar, junto com o Nick Cowdery, de colonialismo de dados. Então, eu tenho certeza que essa mesa vai contribuir muito para essa construção coletiva, e agradeço desde já a Celina e a Ulisses por estarem conosco. Eu vou passar primeiramente a palavra para a professora Celina Nimmerman, e em seguida a gente vai escutar o professor Ulisses, e depois a gente passa às sessões de debate. Eu vou saudar o público que está acompanhando a mesa e dizer a vocês que vocês podem, a qualquer momento, ir escrevendo questões no chat, que eu me encarrego de retomá-las na ocasião do debate. Obrigada, Celina, por favor.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. This is a really nice initiative that I'm very happy to be a part of, so thanks again. I have some slides that I thought I would organize to guide me and you through what I'm planning on talking about. So I think I'll just share my screen now, if you don't mind, and we'll see if this works, hopefully. All right. Okay. Can you see my screen? Okay. All right. So I'm Celina. Thank you, Fernanda, for the introduction. I'm honored to be here. I thought I would start with saying a little bit about myself in terms of what I'm involved with at the moment, just to give you some context with regards to what I'd like to talk about today. My focus is actually going to be on education, because I've been watching this these technological events play out over some years now, and it's cause for concern with regards to the power that social media companies have now, large platforms such as Amazon and their reach into education, which I'll address later. But these are causes for concern with regards to the integrity of students in schools and their privacy rights and all kinds of rights, digital rights, that are not necessarily being taken into account by these large corporations. So first of all, there are two books, as mentioned before, that I've either authored, sole-authored or co-authored. The first one is Everyday Schooling in the Digital Age. And that's a 3-year ethnography in Australia of secondary schools, 3 secondary schools, to look at the kinds of technology uses in school, or sometimes non-use, and whether or not these are useful for children or students, learners, teachers, what the implications are for social implications, ethical implications. So that was with Neil Selwyn at Monash University in Victoria, in Australia. And then more recently, I have had my dissertation. This was actually my dissertation, Biosurveillance in New Media Marketing, where I look at the kinds of technologies being used in consumer surveillance, specific to the bringing in of biometric and neurotechnologies to get more information or affective information about consumers, which is then used to develop advertisements that are then fed back to the individual. So it's a loop. They're taking data from consumers and they're feeding back these data that are personal data and very personal data, including the way they think, the way they feel, designing advertisements according to that and pitching it at people. So these two books, but also I'm involved, or PI, Principal Investigator for the Fair AI in Education project, which is a grant that I've just received as of last year. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. And CHI, Cyber Hygiene in AI-Enabled Domestic Environments. That's specific to AI, IoT, and social housing. So the project, the Fair AI project for me, it's an attempt to affect equitable technology policy development in education. My focus is looking at public-private partnerships and their initiatives with regards to the use of AI and EdTech in education. So as I mentioned before, I'm looking at Amazon, Microsoft, Twitter, but also World Bank, all kinds of universities and NGOs. I'm thinking critically, hopefully, about the implications that these AI systems or EdTech systems in general might have on teaching and learning. And the context I'm looking at is the African context at the moment. Although I'm based in London, I am keeping an eye out on AI in education in London. My main interest, however, is in Ghana and South Africa, and I'm especially interested in the potential benefits, harms and risks that are associated with these leadership roles that large corporations play when it comes to AI in education. One of the first things that I did when I started my project, it started in September of last year. Because of the pandemic, we've had some delays. Fieldwork has been quite difficult for me. I can't get out of the UK to Ghana, but luckily for me, I have a really fantastic postdoc who's doing some fieldwork for me over there. And we started with discourse analysis. I've always been interested in discourse because I do believe that discourse frames the way we behave in the world, what we think, our values, etc., etc. So what I wanted to do was examine the documents that were publicly available on the internet specific to AI and education, but also AI and society more broadly. And I was curious about how AI was being framed. So I elicited the help of a couple of my colleagues, one from UCL, Andreas Flakidis, and University of Western England, Panos Andriotis, and they're computer scientists. And they helped me design some tools to do name entity recognition in order to understand social, political, economic relationships across the different individuals and groups that we were noticing coming up in the documents related to AI and society or AI and education. So there are three themes that I have found to represent what I think is recurring in the documents. There's numerous amounts. I've got 250 now, I think, and it's increasing. So it's a corpus that's growing as the project continues. So the first one is geopolitical dominance through education and technological innovation. And this links to data colonialism, which Ulysses will speak about in a moment. The second is the creation and expansion of market niches. And that relates to rationalities of extraction. Again, I'll leave the bulk of that to Ulysses, but what I wanted to point out here is that in biosurveillance, that the book that I wrote, it was about how consumer markets or consumer niches are created by personal advertising, by individualization, by catering different kinds of advertisements to fit to someone's existing beliefs. So again, if you think about, I think his name is Eli Parisier, he has this idea of filter bubble, where you're only ever exposed to the things that you already like. So because, for example, Amazon knows what you like, that's constantly what you're going to get. So you don't actually have the possibility to explore anything radically different to that. With regards to putting this in an educational context, the same thing would happen to students. With regards to personalized education, having a machine that is driven by AI, making sense of what a student needs, what a student likes, what a student potentially wants to do with their life, and packaging this up in some kind of curriculum, they're narrowing that particular student's world, their particular niche. So you can call that market niche in as much as it's a behavioral environment that is moderated by the technology that is basically foundational to whichever institution you're talking about, whether it's consumer surveillance, whether it's education. So with regards to rationalities of extraction, there's this idea that there was cheap nature, there's cheap labor, there's cheap data, but it's actually, the point of concern for me is that it's the affective part of the data that we have to be worried about, because it's the bit about how we feel, our emotions, how we respond to different triggers that we see in these multimodal media systems. That is what is being mined and fed back to us. And one of the things that I say in biosurveillance is that they're creating needs that are not already there, and they're shaping the way we behave. I think a very good example of the power of this technology in terms of putting us in these niches can be seen in the US election, where the social media system managed to have quite a large amount of the United States population believing that the election was rigged. So an entirely different kind of understanding to the other half of the United States, or however many people there were. But the point is that these social media companies have the power to change the way we think. And they're doing that by mining emotions, mining affect. Also, the third theme is managing narrative perceptions and norms. One of the things you'll find is that for, as you would know, technologies to be successful and to be taken up in general, they must have trust. People must trust in them. So there's a movement for governments and industry to increase public trust in AI systems. So these are the kinds of things that I've started. These are preliminary findings. These are the things I've started looking at. I've started noticing about AI in education and these platforms. So in general, I'm looking at it from an ecological framework, but also taking into account that there are impacts on the natural environment, as well as issues of intersectionality. So some key issues come up. And I've noticed that these are quite prevalent in education, and I imagine they would be quite prevalent in other domains. They're not in order of priority, so I'll just go through them. The first one is a lack of consensus, and this relates to policy, this one, for AI in education. There's a lack of consensus on what artificial intelligence is. it's difficult then to develop regulations and policies for something that people can't agree on a definition for. So how do we regulate these things? And I've said in several areas that the key is to look at algorithms, to look at the processes that are being enacted in schools, in these systems. But that means opening up opening up the black box. So that is a problem in itself. Another problem is cognitive liberty. And that's something I write about in biosurveillance as well, with regards to the need to have the intellectual freedom to be able to make our own choices without being affected by, for example, Facebook, to believe in a particular thing. We want to be able to make our own decisions. We want to have the autonomy to have the cognitive liberty needed to live and exist in a democratic society and participate autonomously in that, or as autonomously as we can. So key here is behavioral nudging, and you'll see a lot of behavioral economics coming into play when it comes to AI in education or AI in society in general. Behavioral nudging, that's quite a significant thing at the moment that's happening in education. The question is it ethical? As I mentioned before, another key issue is the manufacture of trust. How are they doing this? There's also issues of worsening the digital divide. So one of the biggest issues is access to internet for example, Ghana, which is the first country I'm focusing on at the moment, but across the world, really, we can say this. The digital divide can be exacerbated by artificial intelligence in education, largely because it'll be the people who have the money, who have the power and the money to be able to access these things. Whereas the people who don't have access to these systems will be missing out on a particular kind of education. Now, one of the things I've also noticed is that these policies have particular mechanisms in them that are discriminatory, that don't necessarily, although they should be, but they don't necessarily uphold the primacy of us over technology. So it's a matter of needing to decolonize policy as we go through these understandings or these new systems. There's also exploitation of students, basically, with regards to, as I was saying before, the affective dimension of things, where the data is extracted, but not just student data, but affective data in terms of likes. That's data colonialism, and that's also biosurveillance, because it's biological characteristics that are also being taken from us. And the final issue is algorithmic governance. There's a wish or a desire and a push, actually, for data-driven everything. And when we have data-driven everything, and we have industry, we have corporations feeding mass amounts of data to each other, then what type of society are we living in when these social media companies with governments have power over us with regards to imposing particular technical systems on us, as opposed to people like me saying, well, maybe there's another way, maybe there are other systems. Maybe AI in education is not that necessary. Maybe there are other problems that need to be looked at first. One of my focuses is gender, and it's an issue with regards to women compared to men, especially in the global south and access to internet. But in general, there's an issue with access to internet. As I said before, 19% of people in least developed countries do not have access to internet, and whereas 87% of the population of developed countries do. So there's an issue of a lack of parity here. There's an issue that has to be addressed, an issue of fairness in governance. And that means looking at policies and regulations to prevent discrimination and promote well-being of people over profit, of people over technology companies. So what is power? This is a question that I have asked myself as I read through all the documents that I've been reading through for my project and my research in general. How is it manifested? But more particularly with regards to governance and internet governance, how is it exercised through policy making? And as I've been saying, focusing on the modulation and surveillance of affect in these different settings can help us understand where power sits, but also through understanding these algorithmic mechanisms, we can maybe figure out how to regulate in a way that actually protects our rights as individuals. So I wanted to show a practical example actually with regards to the kinds of things that I was saying about platforms in education. And this is something recent that I've just read about, and it's Amazon. And in December of 2018, Jeff Bezos invested in MindStrong Health. And this is a mobile app designed to track users' mood and cognitive states and identify signs of depression and mental health. In April 2017, the year before, Jeff Bezos invested 190 million of his personal funds into EverFi. Now, EverFi promotes itself as a digital wellness network, and the platform is now seeking entry into education to provide teachers and students with digital courses in life skills and STEM and career readiness. If you note that the other investors, if you go to the website, you'll see that Eric Schmidt, the former executive chairman of Google and Alphabet, are investors, and Evan Williams, Twitter co-founder. So with regards to this particular digital wellness network, this EverFi, it is trying to enter all kinds of educational environments, ranging from K to 12 to higher education. And it's relying on, on accessing a lot of data from the students and the teachers to try and improve education. And one of the aims is to make education just, to make education change. And they're using COVID-19 as a way into this, because they're saying that it's necessary more than ever to have a good remote education system. If you have a look at the privacy policy, I've just taken an extract of this. It talks about how EverFi will actually have access to other social media outlets, other platforms such as Facebook and Twitter. So it's no longer just one platform on its own. We know that platforms are in ecosystems, they exist in ecosystems. But in the realm of education, it's not just one platform coming in. It's one platform coming in and then connecting to a bunch of other platforms and bringing them into education. So it's important, I think, to scour these privacy policies, to have a look at what these companies are doing. And one point I want to make is that a lot of them will say that because they're linking, like this one, to other companies, if you're being sent to another company, then there's no accountability on the original company. So who's accountable for privacy when there are different network connections and different people being referred to all over the place? Other questions that I ask myself as I read through everything related to platforms in education, related to how big they're getting, related to how much data they're collecting with regards to what they want to do. I mean, algorithms are trained to understand us, right? But do we actually know how they work? In schools, when I was doing the ethnographic project, most of the teachers had no idea how the algorithms worked. They did not know how the privacy policies work. They didn't understand them. Do we understand how the data accumulated? Well, they didn't, but it's important to do that, right? And what happens with the data? How are normative codes being developed, and whose interests do these norms serve? What does fair look like as a practice in the context of internet governance? Who gets to say what fair is? How can governments facilitate the creation of ethical policies for development goals? Now, ethics for me is a huge focus here, because as I've noticed in throughout this Fair AI project, is that there's a push for AI ethics, global AI ethics. But if you take a look at the individuals and groups that are participating in this ethics setting agenda, they're primarily from the US, from Canada, from Australia, from the UK, from Europe, from China even, but not necessarily from places that have had experiences as colonized spaces. So there's a lack of representation in that respect. So there is a need for grassroots-driven rules, principles, and values upon which we can evaluate our conduct. If we accept these technologies, there's a need to protect human rights and make sure that policies are addressing this. There's a need to act in the best interest of human beings over profit, of animals, and of the natural environment, responsible innovation and regulation, and the need for decolonizing policy and ethics is foundational for building a more equitable and connected world. So that brings me to the end of my chat here. There's a lot more that I'd really like to say about this entire thing, but I'll leave it for Ulysses to pick up on the data colonialism piece. Thank you very much.
Obrigada, Silena, por essa fala tão inspiradora. Realmente tem muitos pontos aí para discutir. Com certeza a gente vai retomá-los na hora do nosso debate. Passo a palavra, então, por favor, ao Ulisses.
Thank you very much. I will also share my screen, if you don't mind, but I did want to start by expressing solidarity with my Brazilian friends. I know you're going through a difficult time because of the pandemic right now, so just know that our thoughts are with you. Thank you to all the organizers for inviting me and for all the hard work that's gone to put together this event. Thank you also for the translators who are working very hard to make sure everyone understands in all three languages. And please excuse me that I will make my presentation in English. It's just the language I'm used to these days in speaking. With that, let me then share my screen. So I'm going to be talking a lot about data colonialism. And it might seem strange to put those two words together, data and colonialism. So the first point I wanted to make is that in some ways, colonialism has always depended on data. I think even whether we think historically or in more recent times, I think there are plenty of examples that illustrate this. For instance, if we think about maps and surveys that colonizers needed to illustrate territories that they were acquiring, or the surveys that they used to collect and manage the data from those territories, clearly all of these things require data. Even if we think about passports, which obviously we all have one these days, but in the context of colonialism, they were very specific tools used to control the movement of people. And of course, to produce passports, again, you needed data from the colonized subjects. If we think about, for instance, plantation spreadsheets that were used to manage haciendas, to manage plantations in colonial times, obviously, this was before the days of Microsoft Excel, but you're seeing here to the left an example of a spreadsheet used to manage the slaves in a plantation. This spreadsheet tracks the cost of acquiring and managing the slaves. This was a plantation in the United States. Even if we think in the context of the global pandemic right now, of vaccination cards, which again, in previous pandemics, were important tools in colonies to manage the movement of bodies, particularly of bodies that were seen as threats, that were seen as polluted bodies, and that needed to be separated from the rest of society so that they wouldn't infect the colonizers. So vaccination cards obviously required data. If we think more generally about census data and why it came to be and how it has been used, not just to collect information about our societies, but again, in extreme cases, for instance, the map I have in the background of Johannesburg in 1901, when they were confronting the Spanish flu, and how they used census data to basically create plague colonies, cities outside of the city where you could send the infected bodies, mostly in this case of people of color, of Black people. And lastly, if we think of forensics and policing data in the context of colonialism again, the invention of fingerprints itself was a technology developed by the British in India, and then of course exported to the rest of the world, but it has very concrete colonial roots. Or even if we think more recently of phenotype guides, such as the one you see to the right of the screen there, which was a guide used by Soviets in Russia to identify different types of faces. So perhaps a prototype of facial recognition. And as you can see in the image there, it was a guide to identify Jewish people, gypsies, and of course, all sorts of people from Central Asia, Muslims, etc. So my point here is that throughout colonialism, the production of data has been crucial to the practice and the management of the colonies, the practice of colonialism. Now, if data has always been an instrument of colonialism, we could be excused for seeing the colonized as mere victims or subjects of the colonizers' technology. But I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. For instance, when I think about data colonialism, I tend to think of my own role in this relationship, not as that of a passive subject, but perhaps more like that of a native informant. And here I'm going to use the example of La Malinche, which is a very common example in Mexico. I'm sure in Brazil you have very similar figures. This was a Nahuatl woman. Her name was Malintzin. She was a slave, basically given to Hernán Cortés, the conquistador of Mexico. She served many different important functions. She was an interpreter. She was an advisor. And basically, she was an intermediary between these two worlds, the European one and the indigenous one. So her role was by no means that of a passive colonial subject. She was an active agent, playing a very important role. Because of that specific role that she played, of course, in Mexico, she is often seen as a traitor. And of course, there's all sorts of elements of misogyny here, to see this particular woman also in the role of a traitor. But regardless of that, whether we like to admit it or not, she's also seen basically as the mother of the race. In particular, the mother of the mestizos, of these hybrid individuals that we are, the Latinx people. So I want to think a little bit about this role of the native informant that Malintzin was playing, but in the context of our digital era and in the context of data. The native informant, actually, if we use this definition provided by Spivak in her important work, A Critique of Post-Colonial Reason, she defined native informants as a figure, quote, who in ethnography can only provide data to be interpreted by the knowing subject for reading. So native informants are all of us who generate this data. And the data is really important not to us, but to the subjects that can read. In other words, the colonizers. So we are, in fact, informing on ourselves, producing data about ourselves. The colony in this context is our social life, and the metropolis is the platform, like Facebook or Google. Perhaps this does constitute in some ways a betrayal of ourselves in this case, where we are exchanging valuable information about our social lives, what would be gold in ancient times, we're exchanging it for trinkets. So this to imply that our role in this new form of colonialism is not passive at all. We are participants. Now, a lot of these ideas that you're seeing, as we are going to untangle them, I would like to introduce you to the work I've done with Nick Coldry, which is captured in this book that you see here, The Cost of Connection. And so all of these ideas were developed with my co-author, Nick Coldry from the London School of Economics. One of the important points in our argument is that we're actually not using the word colonialism metaphorically. Again, it might seem strange to use that word to refer to what's going on. And perhaps people think, well, you're using it metaphorically, but we're not. We are actually suggesting that what we are facing is a new phase of colonialism, what we call data colonialism. This phase of colonialism basically prepares the ground for a new mode of capitalist production. In the same way, perhaps, that the haciendas, that the plantations financed and prepared the way for the factories in industrial capitalism. The wealth generated during colonialism gave shape to this new emerging form of capitalism. And so we're seeing this process again. We don't know yet what that new form of capitalism is going to look like, but we know that it's coming. Now, this is happening, of course, while coexisting with the neo-colonial legacy. So just because we're talking about a new form of colonialism and perhaps a new form of capitalism, the legacy of colonialism is still very much with us in terms of racism, in terms of sexism, in terms of the targeting of specific populations. That hasn't gone away. That's still very much with us. So basically what we're arguing is that whereas the old colonialism grabbed land, grabbed resources and human labor, the new one grabs us, our social lives, as they become abstracted through the medium of data. So basically data is what takes our social lives and converts them into a medium that can be extracted and that it can be used for generating wealth. And this basically represents a potentially global transformation. And this transformation is playing out not just in the global south, but also in the global north. Like colonialism, the historical colonialism, it was also a force that transformed the whole world, not just the south or the north. So let me give you then the official definition of data colonialism, as Nick Coldry and I define it. We say that data colonialism is an emerging order for the appropriation of human life so that data can be continuously extracted from it for profit. We're not against data. We're not against collecting and using data. We're specifically talking about a form of data that is used to extract wealth from our social lives, and that it is used to create that wealth. In other words, for profit. Now, one common question we usually confront is, if we are in fact arguing that this is a new form of colonialism, where is the violence? Colonialism was a brutal genocide that resulted in the elimination of 80 to 90% of the population of the Americas, what is now known as the Americas. So do we expect to see the same kind of violence in data colonialism? Well, obviously not. We hope not. So we're not making a one-to-one comparison, saying that historical colonialism and data colonialism are exactly the same. There are important differences. Differences in terms of the modes, the intensities, in terms of the scales and the context of colonialism. Those are not the same. They're unique to each historical period. But we are saying that there is one important similarity, a crucial similarity, and that is the historical function, which is to dispossess, to extract. What historical colonialism and data colonialism share, in other words, is the similarity of this function, to dispossess. So when we were talking about all of these issues in our work, we wanted to name the new colonial powers clearly and specifically. And we didn't want to just say, for instance, internet companies or Silicon Valley. So to be more specific, we came up with the concept of the social quantification sector. This is basically an industry sector that is devoted to the development of the infrastructure required for the kind of extraction that we're talking about. And what this allows us to do is that we can now talk not just about media, but about everything, every aspect of our lives that are now that in interface with data. Whether we're talking about the collection of data for health, for agriculture, for education, as Selena just described, the social quantification sector includes all of those uses. So yes, we are talking about the big players here in the social quantification sector: Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and the like. Since this is a new colonial order with two different poles, one in the United States and the other one in China, we also point out the big players in China as well, such as Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and Xiaomi. What's interesting about these big players is that they are not just monopolies, they are also monopsony hybrids. And these are both terms from economics. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but basically the difference is that a monopoly is a marketplace characterized, as you know, by the presence of a single seller. A monopsony is characterized by the presence of a single buyer, not a seller, but a buyer. And so in this day and age when we are all producers of media, these big companies are acting as the single buyers of the content that we produce. Now, apart from these big players, we do have a big environment of smaller players of different sizes. So if you think about all the hardware manufacturers, the software manufacturers, the platforms that we talked about, yes, includes Facebook, but also the other ones. The data analytics companies, the data brokerage companies. So it's quite a big sector. It's not just the big ones, including these smaller companies that Selena talked about that have to do with education or with health and the collection of data related to those fields as well. Okay. Let me shift topics a little bit and tell you more about the coloniality of data relations. Because in the book, what we do is we conduct various forms of trans-historical analysis. using the colonial past to try to understand what is happening in the present. And we organize these transhistorical comparisons in terms of the game plan used to play strategy video games. That game plan is known as the 4X model. It includes explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. And these are the same strategies that you use when you play a video game like the one you see here in the background, which some of you might recognize. It's part of Sid Meier's Civilization series. And this is Colonialism, the video game. In this game, you can play the British, the French, the Portuguese, and the Dutch, I believe. And what you have to do to win the game is apply these 4 strategies: explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. The natives, of course, and their resources are controlled by the computer. They're not even full sentient players. We don't have time to explore all of those, so let me just focus on one of them. In fact, the one on exploration. And what I want to do here is compare 2 historical documents. The first one is the terms of use of Google Chrome, which are very similar to the same terms of use that Selena was talking about. But this is basically what happens when you install Google Chrome. In case you haven't read the terms of service, let me just quote briefly the section that says that when you install Google Chrome, you give Google, quote, a perpetual, irrevocable, worldwide, royalty-free, and non-exclusive license to reproduce, adapt, modify, translate, publish, publicly perform, publicly display, and distribute any content which you submit, post, or display to others through the services. I know, it's a mouthful, but basically, when we install Google Chrome, this is what we are giving permission to Google to do with our data. I want to compare this to another historical document. This document is called the Requerimiento. It was a document read by Spanish conquistadors when they arrived in the New World and they were about to conquer a village or a city. Sometimes they would arrive in the middle of the night under cover of darkness. And they would proceed to read this document in Spanish to a population that did not speak Spanish. The document read in part, but if you do not submit, I certify to you that with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highnesses may command. And we shall take away your goods and shall do all the mischief and damage that we can. That is the Spanish Requerimiento 1513. Please click accept and install there. My point is not to suggest, obviously, that what happened or that what happens after we install Google Chrome is the same thing that happened after the Requerimiento was read. Rather, my point is to call attention to the use of this abstract, incomprehensible language to carry out this initial act of dispossession. Now, the reason this system that I've been describing works so well is because it is based in new rationalities that have very deep roots with old rationalities from our colonial past. Let's start with cheap nature. In order to colonize the world, nature had to be framed as cheap. It was said to be abundant. It was said to be free, just there for the taking. From a legal perspective, it was said to be without an owner, at least a civilized owner. That's where the concept of terra nullius comes from, which in Latin means no man's land. The colonizer arrived, saw all of this land, said, great, it's not occupied by anybody, so I can take it. And if it is occupied. Those people who live in it are not full human beings. From cheap nature, we move then to cheap labor. And here again, in colonialism, some human beings, and this was mostly determined by race, they were meant to provide the labor required to transform nature into wealth. So the exploitation, the abuse, the genocide, in many cases, that happened with this extraction were framed as social progress. It was said to be for the good of humanity, even for the salvation of these same people that were being exploited. So we can trace a transition from cheap nature to cheap labor, now to cheap data. And as you can see, some of the same extractive rationalities that we saw with nature and with labor are also at play here. Cheap data is said to be abundant. It's said to be free. It's just there for the taking. And it's said to be without an owner, at least in its aggregate form. Yes, you and I produce it individually, but in order to really exploit it and make something useful out of it, it needs processing, like oil, which means it needs advanced technologies that only some corporations have access to. So our job, your job, and my job is only to generate it. And we are told that this is what progress looks like. So how do we even begin to resist all of this? And so now to wrap up the last part of the section, I want to talk about a proposal to begin to unthink these rationalities. This proposal is for a non-aligned technology movement, and it is a proposal I'm developing with many people, including Juan Ortiz-Froehler, my colleague from the Tierra Común network. And basically, the question here is, how do we create an activist movement to resist data colonialism? Now, a movement of non-alignment actually has a history. The original non-aligned movement emerged during the Cold War. And this was a way for nations in the global south to basically say, we don't want to go the route of capitalism, nor do we want to go the route of communism. We must find a third way. So with the non-aligned technologies movement, we're trying to identify a similar alternative. We want to be able to say no, on the one hand, to the profit model of Silicon Valley, where anything is allowed as long as it can demonstrate that it can make money. But on the other hand, we also want to reject the model of the Chinese Communist Party, where the point of the system is just to use data to control and to monitor and to exercise power over populations. What might this movement look like? I think we can envision different forms of non-alignment. For instance, in terms of infrastructure, we can imagine non-aligned apps, non-aligned platforms, non-aligned search engines, etc., non-aligned internet service providers. Many of these things already exist. We already have the technology. It's just a question of launching a movement where we can all agree and support each other in using these tools. We can talk perhaps about non-aligned data. What would that look like? What would non-aligned health data look like? What about non-aligned economic data? In the example Fernanda was giving at the beginning of Microsoft and its partnership with the Brazilian government, it's like, well, how could we generate data that is non-aligned with that model of that partnership between these big corporations and the government? Non-aligned environmental data, etc. Could we perhaps imagine non-aligned organizations? Perhaps, yes, eventually get to non-aligned nations. But while we get there, maybe we can think smaller and start smaller, perhaps with non-aligned schools, perhaps non-aligned departments within schools, or perhaps start with cities in the global south, in Brazil and elsewhere that can become non-aligned. And obviously, this will result in forms of collective knowledge that are also non-aligned. And this is where we can develop and talk about decolonial theory and practice. We can incorporate what we've learned from technofeminisms. We can develop algorithm observatories, which, as Selena was pointing out, we need them to understand just how these algorithms work and operate. In terms of cultural proposals, maybe even talk about a theater of the oppressed by data, using as inspiration, of course, the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire. So just to end my presentation here, I want to talk about the principles of what this non-aligned movement could be, what the principles of decolonizing data could be. And here I want to emphasize that the non-aligned technologies movement is a work in progress. We haven't even agreed on these principles. So these are just the unofficial contributions as I see them from my perspective. But my own take on what these principles could be revolve around strategies that other movements struggling against settler colonialism and environmental destruction have already had success in applying. These include then boycott, divestment, and sanction movements and principles that we can apply in the non-aligned technologies movement. So in terms of boycott, perhaps ways of opting out individually from different platforms. In terms of divestment, perhaps opting out as organizations. And in terms of sanctions, perhaps thinking about ways in which we can nationalize or municipalize our data. Now, these strategies of BDS, as they're known, need to be supplemented, I think, with other strategies that broaden or enlarge the scope of the activism. So I think these strategies also need to be supplemented with knowledge, culture, and solidarity. In terms of knowledge, we need to rely on one of the most powerful weapons in the decolonial struggle. And that weapon is imagination. Because when colonialism couldn't be resisted with bodies, it could always be resisted with minds. So I think knowledge and imagination are a crucial part of this equation. We can apply that knowledge to create culture, to figure out basically what tools of data colonialism we can appropriate and reimagine, and what tools we need to reject. Like Audre Lorde asked, can the master's tools be used to dismantle the master's house? I think the answer is yes, to a certain extent. But figuring out the limits and the ways in which we need to abandon the master's tools, I think that is basically, in essence, the creation of culture. And finally, I think we need to act globally. We need to establish connections with other non-aligned parties that respect our diversity and our difference, but that unite us at the end of the day against our common enemies. So perhaps there's something useful in this old cliche of acting globally, acting both locally and globally. Decolonizing data needs to be a cultural project that is at once aligned with our community's goals of freedom and justice, but also aligned against the goals of extractivist corporations and states. Aligned, in other words, with the non-aligned across the world. Thank you very much. I will end there.
Obrigada, Ulisses, por essa ótima fala. Eu vou, então, iniciar a nossa sessão de debate. E como E eu estou recebendo aqui pela Luísa as questões do público, então quero reiterar para o público que coloque as questões no chat e que eu vou retomá-las aqui para os palestrantes. Bom, eu vou fazer algumas questões, né, algumas delas, né, eu vou começar com uma questão que toca no tema da educação e que, portanto, traz para a nossa conversa um tema com o qual a Celina trabalha mais diretamente, mas, por favor, Ulisses, você também está convidado a reagir a essa questão e também, quando eu colocar a próxima questão que eu tenho também em relação ao colonialismo de dados, ela se dirige a vocês dois, embora uma ou outra possa estar mais diretamente ligada ao trabalho de um de vocês. Celina e Ulisses, eu quero primeiro retomar a questão da educação, né, que a Celina trouxe, e realmente aqui no Brasil, acho que tem muitas similaridades entre Brasil, África do Sul especialmente, mas enfim, acho que também se a gente pensar em termos de América Latina, né, em relação à presença dessas grandes corporações de tecnologia na área de educação. E a minha questão tem a ver com o nível de dependência, de um lado, que essas plataformas criam, né, no sistema estatal e privado, né, público e privado de educação. Então, isso é algo que eu gostaria de ouvir um pouco você, Celina, que tem um trabalho de campo, né, na África, se você, para além da questão da própria extração de conhecimento sobre os afetos, os estados cognitivos, psicológicos, os processos de aprendizagem dos alunos, que é uma questão importantíssima, eu vou voltar nela. Além dessa extração de conhecimento, que, por sua vez, acaba alimentando estratégias de ensino, de aprendizagem, você também percebe algo que nós percebemos aqui, que é a criação de uma dependência dessas ferramentas oferecidas pelas grandes plataformas por parte do setor público e do setor privado, não apenas em termos de usabilidade, mas também porque essas plataformas, com um Estado que acaba reduzindo muito o investimento na educação, como a gente tem percebido nos últimos anos no Brasil, há uma migração em massa que aumentou muitíssimo na pandemia das universidades, por exemplo, que estavam relativamente fora dessas plataformas e que agora estão massivamente adotando essas plataformas no âmbito do seu cotidiano institucional, né? E aqui no Brasil a gente tem um projeto que se chama Educação Vigiada, que é um projeto da Universidade Federal do Pará, que tem mostrado como que a migração, né, a precarização dos investimentos estatais no ensino tem aumentado enormemente a dependência das universidades e das redes públicas em geral de ensino em relação a essas plataformas. Eu pergunto se você vê isso também no seu campo de trabalho, em outros domínios, e também te pergunto mais detalhes, quer dizer, como que você consegue, em termos metodológicos, pesquisar como essa extração de conhecimento sobre as habilidades afetivas, cognitivas, emocionais dos alunos, dos estudantes, vem sendo feitas, uma vez que essas plataformas, a gente sabe, são bastante fechadas no que diz respeito à observação dos dos seus processos de extração de dados e de produção de mineração desses dados e de produção de conhecimento a partir disso.
That's a very interesting question. So let me see if I've understood your questions correctly. The first one is a dependency, that you're asking about dependency on these platforms. And the other second, well, there are a few questions there, but the other one relates to how do we study these systems. Am I correct to assume that these are the two primary questions? Yes? Okay, so I'll talk about the dependence piece. I can speak specifically with regards to AI at the moment, but because there's a global discourse that AI is going to change everything. When it comes to education, you even have UNESCO talking about how AI will transform teaching and learning. The problem here is that a lot of this hype is based on decontextualized information. So there's not really sufficient studies in, educational areas, educational sectors that look at, the real world impacts that AI could potentially have on education. With regards to COVID though, that has kind of opened up education to large platforms to just swoop in and say, well, hey, we have these systems that we're using for example, I'm going to use Amazon again, for selling. It works really well. We're going to try and move this into education because we have the infrastructure, we've got all the skills there. We have the networks, we have the resources, we have all the people we need to get in place. We have other investors. We know all these people in the social platform ecosystem like Facebook and Twitter, they can all join. And they're using this crisis as a way into education. And what happens, and this was prevalent and obvious in the ethnography I did in Australia, is that as schools, whether they're K-12 or higher ed, get used to a system, they become dependent on it. And when the system goes down, for example, nobody knows what to do. So, for example, the ethnography I spoke about, the school I was responsible for when it came to research, I was an ethnographer then. The first week I was there, the internet went down. And because all of the teachers had done everything online, all their presentations were online, they were relying on their systems to give them information about who was there at school. Nobody knew what to do. The students were happy because there was no school. There were no resources to teach the students, but the teachers, one of them didn't even remember that you could connect a computer to a printer with a USB cable. And there was also another thing that shows the implications of this reliance on these platforms and these systems is that they had put all of their information online, and there was an emergency fire drill one day when the internet went down. Nobody knew which children were present because all of that information, all that data was online. People were not putting it in hard copy anymore. So if it was a real fire emergency, nobody would know where the children were, if they're alive, if they're stuck in a building. That's just a practical example of the reliance on these platforms. When it comes to the ones that are happening now, post-pandemic, with regards to Amazon, I'm going on about Amazon, aren't I? But Amazon wanting to go into these higher education institutions and K-12 institutions with their mental health and wellness apps that track, students' mental health, track their dispositions, but track their skills, track what they're studying, track how many hours they're spending on these things, looking at their eyeballs, who knows what they're going to do. But Amazon has the capacity to put all of these things into schools. And once you get in there and the schools and the teachers are giving over authority to these systems to tell them how to teach, to give them, snapshots about their students, that is a very strange dependence on a system that may not necessarily be acting in your best interests. So I'm not sure if I'm answering that properly, but there is that dependency when technology goes into institutions. Whether or not that's going to happen in Ghana, for example, I'm not sure yet. We're still looking at what's happening on the ground with regards to different initiatives. I know that Google is in Accra. There is, I believe it's Accra. Twitter's just announced their headquarters in Ghana. Microsoft is in there. So it's a matter of going into schools, I think, which is what I'll be doing, and seeing the kinds of systems that are being used and how they're being used with regards to methodologies to look at how affect is captured. You can do that by looking at what they're collecting, and you can observe how this happens. And a lot of the time, it's going to be very similar to Facebook in terms of what it looks like, because children like using Facebook. There's already an app that's a platform that is very popular across the world called Schoology. I think that's how you pronounce it, SCHOOLOGY. It looks like Facebook, but it collects an incredible amount of data. So to study that, observations, ethnographies, interviews, focus groups, talk, that's the only way to do it. Unless Ulysses has a better, another addition to that.
Not really. I think Selena, she's the expert and she did a great job answering that question.
Ótimo. Obrigada, Selena. Eu tenho uma questão agora, retomando o tema do colonialismo de dados, né? E mais especificamente a questão entre o antigo e o novo colonialismo, de uma perspectiva aqui, enfim, mais brasileira, né? Latino-americana, talvez. Então, o processo de extração, né, exploração de terras e recursos, de mão de obra barata e de vida social parecem estar intimamente interligados com o colonialismo de dados e com a inteligência artificial de uma forma geral, né? Quer dizer, especialmente no chamado sul global, essas três camadas de exploração, né, da terra, dos recursos, do trabalho e dos dados se sobrepõem atualmente, né? Quando a gente olha para a extração dos dados, ela parece mais globalmente distribuída, enquanto que, mesmo que a gente saiba que tem assimetrias e desigualdades, essas assimetrias e desigualdades não parecem ser tão gritantes quando a gente olha, por exemplo, para a exploração de trabalho, que a gente sabe que é enorme para a alimentação do capitalismo de dados e para o colonialismo de dados, e para os impactos ambientais, tanto em termos de energia quanto em termos de extração de minerais, que, por sua vez, alimentam o colonialismo de dados e esse novo modelo de capitalismo. Então, a minha pergunta é sobre o que é novo e o que é velho nesse processo e como que isso se redistribui dependendo de onde a gente se posiciona em termos de sul global e norte global.
Thank you, Fernanda. My Portuguese is not very good, but I was looking at the chat and I know there's a similar question from Rafael Evangelista, which is basically this question of, in this new order of data colonialism, are there players, actors, people who are more and less colonized? I think that's in essence, Fernanda, what you are also asking. And I think to begin to answer that question, we need to recognize that colonialism was in some ways an evenly distributed project in the sense that the wealth wasn't distributed evenly. Obviously, one part of the world and one set of people became very rich, while the other majority were underdeveloped. But what I mean by a distributed project is that those relationships, the relationships of colonialism, existed throughout the world. In other words, as people have pointed out, the global South after colonialism was in the global North, and the North was in the South. Thanks to migration, people from the global South started to move and live in the North, in the center of the empire. And thanks to all of these management techniques that we also talked about, the North was also in the South. So those boundaries, I think, sort of become more porous and more difficult to demarcate clearly. I think you are right that in some ways the resources are different. If we were previously talking about land and then about labor, data is a very different resource. And I don't believe the cliche that data is just like the new oil. Obviously, it is very different than oil. It's not just a substance like oil. Maybe the processes of extraction can appear similar, but I don't think it serves as well to equate data to just land or labor. But I think, as I said in the presentation, the function of these very different kinds of colonialism is the same, and it is about the extraction. Maybe today we don't have the appropriation of land like we did in the old colonialism. But today what we have is precision agriculture. That is a way to datify the land. And through algorithms, through robotics, we have an emerging field, which I would say it's part of the social quantification sector of not just producing food, but producing data about how that food is being produced. And I think the repercussions of this will be very clear. We have heard the phrase, which I know you have it in Portuguese too, from farm to table, to really encompass the whole production process of food. Imagine what that process will look like when Amazon is in charge of that chain from beginning to end, when they provide the algorithms and the artificial intelligence and the data centers to capture all the information about how our food is grown and how it is then processed, how it is sold in supermarkets owned by Amazon, which we already have in the United States, Whole Foods, to then how that food ends up being in our refrigerators, which are smart refrigerators equipped with Alexa, which can tell us, and can track how that food is being consumed. So again, from farm to table, we will have that whole process owned by one of these big corporations, Amazon or Google, perhaps. In terms of labor, you already pointed out at the beginning of this talk the ways in which labor is being datified. And it's being measured and through partnerships, with, for example, between Microsoft and the Brazilian government, how that data is becoming a source of wealth. So yes, I know I'm again speaking too much, but to go back to this question of, are we all colonized the same way? No. And the same differences that mattered 500 years ago and 200 years ago continue to matter today. In terms of racial differences, in terms of gender, in terms of class, some people in data colonialism are paying a heavier price, and those people are the same populations that were discriminated against and oppressed during historical colonialism. So in a way, yes, we're all being colonized. Maybe some of us are being more agentic, some of us are more native informats, but some segments of the population continue to pay a heavier price. So in that sense, I think colonialism is not evenly distributed.
Celina?
Thanks yes, absolutely. I was going to add to what Ulysses said with regards to the question that Fernanda asked me before about methodology. I should have actually said this because it's obvious that data colonialism is the perfect framework to examine these new things. As well, I'm also having a look at the chat, and it is necessary to have an interdisciplinary, I think, approach to this, with not just the humanities and the social sciences, but also the computer scientists. So that I'm not taking up too much time, because I see that we've got only a few minutes left. Biopolitics as well, and Mbemba's work in terms of making sense of the ideologies that are leaking into or seeping into society through these technologies. I think it's useful to look at that as well. Again, I think it's important to look at the psychosocial and how these technologies not just have material effects, but also they have very psychosocial effects. So, the mind is almost being colonized here. So I don't know if this is too much, Ulysses, or too much of a stretch, but can we say the mind is land now? Can we say our mind is the space that's being colonized?
Yes, for sure. And again, this is not a new concept. Theorists of colonialism have been talking about this for a long time. And in fact, I'm thinking specifically of the work of Ashish Nandy, an Indian writer, an intellectual, who wrote a book called The Intimate Enemy. The idea that colonialism became something embedded in our brains. How much more intimate than that can a process be? So I think it is for sure something that happens in the mind. But as I said in my presentation, hopefully that also means that this new form of colonialism is something that can also be resisted with the mind.
Agora eu vou colocar algumas questões que vieram do público para vocês. O Ulisses antecipou a questão do Rafael, evangelista, mas antes do Rafael, a Helena Martins tinha perguntado sobre imperialismo, né? Trazido a questão do imperialismo para dialogar com o colonialismo. Eu vou, e que é muito parecida com o que o Ulisses já comentou, mas eu vou colocar a questão dela de toda forma, que ela fala o seguinte: de fato, nosso conhecimento está sendo cada vez mais apropriado. Se isso é comum, a forma de extração não é diferente entre os países, né? A gente já falou disso aqui. Me parece potente pensar o imperialismo. As corporações são do norte global, o maior fluxo de dados vem do sul. Vemos isso quando consideramos, por exemplo, os usos de redes sociais. Então, essa é uma primeira questão. E a segunda questão do Rafael Evangelista era endereçada à Silena, e eu vou ler aqui. Assim, as inteligências artificiais justas, equitativas, não correm o risco, né, Fair AI, não correm o risco de cair no discurso das grandes corporações como argumento que fazem exploração ética? Vamos ficar com essas duas questões por enquanto, e depois eu vou pedir para vocês responderem serem mais breves nas respostas, para dar tempo para a gente colocar as outras questões do público, tá bem?
Should I just briefly mention about the point on imperialism, which I think is a good point. Perhaps it's a question of semantics, the difference between colonialism and imperialism. To me personally, basically, I think the difference is in terms of the intensity and the scale of time. I think right now we're still at the beginning of this phenomenon that we're calling data colonialism, and hopefully we can still do something about it. If we allowed it to continue, then I would expect that we would see a more imperialistic order take over the world, which, like I said, perhaps the United States and China occupying those two central poles, but hopefully we won't get there. Selena, I think the other question was for you.
Thank you. Yes, is fair AI even a thing? Is it possible? There was a leaked document recently. Well, today I saw this from the EU saying that it's high risk. AI in education assessing students is high risk. So then, if AI is being put into education, when we think about fairness, who's benefiting from this? Who is not benefiting from this? Who's being left behind? And it will tend to be historically marginalized populations who are left behind, largely because they don't have the money to access the things they need to access, but also they're easy pickings. And it tends to be, with the language of inclusion and all of this, there's a real focus on looking at marginalized groups and getting data on that. So the answer, the idea of fair AI, I'm not sure that is a thing yet. And that I think that will come from grassroots work. And I'm very curious about this about non-alignment and how that would fit into fair AI, or the fairness of AI in education and fairness of AI in society in general.
Obrigada, Celina e Ulisses. A outra questão colocada pelo Vitor Pinhas Arnaud foi colocada em inglês. Eu vou ler aqui em português para os que estão nos ouvindo nessa língua. A pergunta é se vocês pensam que tecnologias como Mastodon, por exemplo, seriam uma primeira tentativa de essas tecnologias de não alinhamento de que falavam Ulisses.
Yes, I think so. And I'm a big supporter of open source technologies and the appropriation of technologies, even the use of technologies against their original intention. So I'm not against, for instance, activists using Facebook, even though I'm against Facebook, but at some points I recognize that for tactical purposes, that's what we have to do. The one issue I would say, Victor, is I think with open source and other solutions like Mastodon, we do need to look a little bit broader and larger, because at the end of the day, open source can also be used for the same extractive purposes. I mean, as a matter of fact, most of the web today runs on open source software, and companies like IBM, like Google, actively develop open source software. The Android operating system that I have on my phone is supposedly open source. My point is that we do need to continue to develop these kinds of solutions, but also be critical about the way in which they can be used for the same purposes of data colonialism.
Celina, você quer acrescentar alguma coisa, reagir a essa questão também?
I think I'm fine. I'll leave this one with Ulysses. Thank you.
Ok. Bom, a próxima e longa questão é do Marco Antônio Alves, professor da UFMG, é a Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, no Brasil, e é uma questão que se endereça a Ulisses. Ele começa falando sobre a leitura, né, do livro do Ulisses com Nick Coldre, que é uma grande contribuição para pensar contemporaneamente as novas formas de capitalismo, e na percepção dele, a noção de colonialismo de dados permite complementar a noção de capitalismo de vigilância proposta pela Shoshana Zuboff, e introduzindo uma visão desde o sul global, uma perspectiva desde o sul global. E a pergunta que ele quer fazer é sobre a tese defendida no livro de que um novo colonialismo de dados diferente do colonialismo histórico, não seria violento. Eu penso que pode ser interessante relacionar o argumento central do colonialismo de dados, a extração, né, a ideia de extração, com a leitura do Mbembe, Achille Mbembe, o filósofo camaronês Achille Mbembe, sobre a necropolítica e o processo de devir negro do mundo. Em suma, em resumo, a minha questão, diz o Marco Antônio, seria o colonialismo de dados pode ser intimamente relacionado à necropolítica, assim como as plantations, né, e a escravidão moderna constituíram o outro lado do liberalismo europeu?
Yes, thank you, Marco Antonio, for that question. And I think you're right. I do want to be clear that the reason Nick and I try to be very careful about our argument about violence is not to suggest that there is no violence in data colonialism. Clearly there is. However, we try to be careful because when we use that word colonialism, which has, as you know, a very specific history, we do not want to equate the kind of violence that we're seeing right now with a genocide that, like I said earlier, resulted in the elimination of 90% of the population of this continent. So we don't want to make that equation to say this is just like that genocide. That's why we're careful. But you are right that there is necropolitics very much at work here. I think data colonialism is violent in two very different levels. At the symbolic level, as we said, even as Selina pointed out, data colonialism colonizes the mind. And so that is a form of violence in the sense that as we colonize young minds, they may not be able to think of alternatives, to think of a reality that is different. That is, of course, very much a form of violence. But there is also very much a form of physical violence that hasn't gone away. And I'll just give you a quick example, which is, speaking of algorithms and artificial intelligence, the recent example of an algorithm in the United States used by hospitals and insurance companies. And this algorithm basically determined whether patients got further care, medical care, if they got extra care. And the algorithm was actually found to be racist and to favor white people, to recommend extra medical care for white people and not recommend extra care for Black people. This is an algorithm that was used by millions of people, and millions of Black people in the United States were impacted by it. That's a very clear form of physical violence in this new emergent order of data colonialism. So that violence has not gone away, and it is the same populations that were paying a heavy price in the old colonialism that continue to pay it today.
Selina, quer complementar algo a essa questão?
Just to reiterate, the violence is psychosocial violence. It's violence up here for me, harm, with regards to tampering with the way we feel about things, with the way we think about things, changing the way we behave. That is violence. That is an absolute incursion into my integrity as a person. So that is how I see it as violent, amongst other things, but that is primarily the problem for me, that kind of psychosocial violence.
Bem, nós já estamos chegando perto do final do painel e eu vou fazer uma última rodada com você, devolvendo a palavra a vocês, Ulisses e Celina, para encerrar, fazer uma breve fala de encerramento, ressaltando o que vocês desejarem, mas eu vou deixar uma provocação aqui para vocês dois, no sentido de vocês trazerem também a dimensão que vocês dois tocaram de forma breve na apresentação de vocês, mas que modos, né, de resistência, insurgência, subversão a gente pode pensar aí no âmbito, seja do colonialismo de dados, seja dessa outra dimensão que a Celina tem trabalhado, desse colonialismo mental, íntimo, subjetivo, que nos assola. E aí vocês podem também fazer o encerramento.
Celina, do you want to start?
How about you go, Ulysses?
Well, yes, I mean, I think there are ways to resist. And I think just like colonialism, it was a very complex problem. Data colonialism is as well, because it's compounded, it's built on top of the old colonialism. So there's no easy solution. I think solutions are going to have to be come from different directions, different channels. I think opting out of platforms, I'm not going to use Facebook anymore, is not going to be enough. I think it's a good starting point, but it's not going to be enough. I think putting pressure on governments is crucial to regulate these corporations. But again, it's not going to be enough. I think basically we need to find ways of decolonizing our lives, decolonizing time and space. The time that we spend in front of screens, there might not be anything wrong with that per se, especially in this day and age when we can't see each other in real life. But let's remember that behind the screen, there's a whole infrastructure extracting and collecting data from us. So we need to decolonize that time spent with these technologies and decolonize the space too. The space that has been infiltrated by surveillance cameras or even by digital devices in our homes, in our kitchens, in our bedrooms. I think we need to decolonize that. And for that, I think we need a cultural movement. We need to use our imaginations, because this is not just a technological problem, it's not just a political problem or an economic problem. I think it's a cultural problem in essence. And thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you today.
Celina?
So, okay, I'm unmuted. I just wanted to add a couple of things to what Ulysses said in terms of initiatives extending across the world. I think it was amazing for me to come to this event and listen to what others have to say, and to realize that there are similar thoughts on my side of the world. And I think it's necessary to reach out across communities from one side of the world to the other and engage in more of these kinds of things, engage in understanding how to theorize these phenomena, how to develop policies, what you're doing now, and just to talk, just have a space to talk about our ideas and feel like there are others feeling the same way. And I think that's also important as something that is a display of solidarity, so that there are so many of us out there. We just need to connect to each other and start a conversation as a larger group. That's all I have to say, but thank you for having me here.
Obrigada, Celina e Ulisses, mais uma vez, por esse ótimo painel, foi muito provocador. Eu acho que se tem não é propriamente, obviamente não é uma vantagem, mas se tem algo que a gente tira de bom né, da história do colonialismo hoje, né, é que se por um lado ele é, né, uma longa história de opressão, de extração, de dominação, ele também é uma longa história de resistência, de reinvenção, de capacidade de reinventar a partir do desastre, da ruína. Então, quando se traz para o campo da tecnologia, para o campo da internet, essa imagem que, como disse Ulisses, não é uma metáfora, né? Está falando de processos bem reais, mas é também uma ferramenta de pensamento, é também uma imagem de pensamento que nos ajuda a encontrar ferramentas de resistência, né? O colonialismo, eu acho que, ou as perspectivas decoloniais, elas nos ajudam a avançar nessa direção, né? Então, eu acho que tanto a Celina quanto o Ulisses, agradecendo mais uma vez, e a Escola de Governança da Internet, trazendo esse painel com essas pessoas para discutir aqui, nos ajudam a colocar nossa imaginação, nossa fabulação, nossa inventividade político-tecnológica, sociotécnica, para funcionar e tentar construir coletivamente saídas, né? Saídas que, como vocês disseram aqui, não são simples, não tem fórmula mágica, não são únicas, né? A gente vai ter um patchwork de ferramentas e táticas e trabalhos cotidianos, trabalhos no âmbito da política maior, no âmbito da micropolítica, no âmbito subjetivo, enfim. E eu acho que discutir, debater, como a gente está fazendo aqui, é um passo essencial, não é suficiente, mas é necessário para que a gente consiga avançar e fazer as alianças que possam nos ajudar a atravessar todos esses desafios sobre os quais a gente conversou aqui. Muito obrigada mais uma vez a vocês, muito obrigada ao público pelas questões e obrigada de novo por todo o staff aqui do NIC.BR, do CGI, da Escola de Governança. Enfim, não sei se a Luísa quer fazer algum fechamento ou se eu mesma encerro o debate. A mesa.
Oi, Fernanda. Eu só reforço as suas palavras e agradeço a presença de vocês aqui hoje, numa conversa que fechou com chave de ouro, eu acho, todo esse ciclo de debates, para nos trazer mais conteúdo e um pensamento mais crítico sobre como que a gente está vivendo essa fase, como que a gente quer o mundo que a gente vai viver no futuro. Obrigada, e obrigada a todos que nos acompanharam e que interagiram, fazendo com que esse debate conseguisse ser mais rico ainda com a participação de vocês.